Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Labor unions in the United States today are only a shadow of their former selves. While union membership stood at 35% in the 50s, today only 10% of U.S. workers belong to a union, compared to 65% in Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, and 92% in Iceland. What has caused this decline in union membership? And what impact has it had on the wages and well-being of working people in this country? Has it been a factor in the widening inequality gap that exists between the 1% and the 99%? Stephanie Luce is professor of labor studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate School. She's the author of a number of books and articles on the history of labor unions, and we'll be talking with her about the vanishing unions and how this all came to be. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
You know, I consider myself lucky because every job that I have held for some period of time, say 5 years or more, has been a union job. I've been a union member, you know, with the the wages and the benefits. So it's hard for me to accept that only 10% of working Americans belong to unions. Yes. And I think if you look at the public sector, it's higher. It's what, about 35%? Yes. And in the private sector, only about 6 to 7%. I was also surprised to learn that the peak of union membership in this country back in the 50s was only 35%. Right. Because I always thought we were a much more unionized country than we are. So what's happened?
Yeah, you've had a really unusual experience being in unions, but I would say a number of factors. Some are from the unions themselves. They could have done a better job at staying on top of changing industries, and they could have, some of the unions had a discriminatory past. They didn't always embrace immigrant workers, black workers, women. But I would say the bigger factor is in the last 30 to 40 years, there's been a really concerted attack on unions, both in the legal realm and also in corporate practice. And so we've seen the rise of what's called the union avoidance industry, which is corporations hiring lawyers and consultants to break unions or keep unions out. And we've seen a real change in labor laws. Our labor laws in this country aren't great in the first place, but they've been very weakly enforced.
Right. It used to be the Wagner Act,
yes.
Under which, I'm thinking back to movies like Norma Ray, yes. Where I guess organizers would come in, you get a certain number of workers to sign a petition, which allowed you to have an election, and if so many voted for a union, then you were a union.
Right.
But that, I gather, and you had the National Labor Relations Board, I gather fewer workers are trying to organize that way anymore.
Partly it's that there's a lot of increase in when workers do try to organize, they are fired or they're punished or they're retaliated against. And so some of the studies find that 7 out of 10 workers are fired when they try and form a union.
But wasn't that always the case? Wasn't employers would strike back?
Yeah, there were a lot of employer retaliation, but I think that what's happened is employers are getting away with it, and they're also being more aggressive about it. So as union membership declines, employers have more to gain by breaking the union, because if their competitor's non-union, they don't want to be union.
But retaliation, it used to be illegal. They're not supposed to do that, right?
Right, and it still is illegal, and that's the problem with our laws, is that there's very little chance that the employer will be penalized, or the case will take years. So an employee might lose their job, but it takes 5 years to even get their case heard, and at best case, they'll get their job back. But most workers can't afford to invest that kind of legal case.
I know we had a Supreme Court, you talk about, the laws have become more restrictive on unions. And I guess the Supreme Court decision just a couple of years ago outlawed union shops, so that, I guess before you might necessarily belong to the union, but you had to pay dues because you got the advantage of the collective bargaining. Right. And the court says you can't do that, and you can't force them to pay dues,
so there's been a variety of cases at the state level, and now, just recently at the Supreme Court level, which is applying in the public sector, which says that you can't mandate that people pay dues to their union. But it's a lot of unions are in fact fighting back, and they're recognizing that, they don't need to necessarily rely on the laws, that they can still organize without, even outside of the laws.
I was saying that there are some countries Scandinavian countries in particular, that are highly unionized. How about the rest of Union? How about places like France, Germany, Italy?
Well, France is an unusual case. It has an even lower union rate than we do, but they have very strong sectoral bargaining. And then countries like Germany, they have also found that their union rates have been declining. So much of Europe has seen union decline, the UK, Germany. They're still much higher than ours. But what those countries have that we don't have is that unions have a seat at the table in industry-wide bargaining. So, the whole retail industry or the whole trucking industry, the unions may have a say in setting wages for the entire sector. And we don't have that here in this country.
And so what they are able to come up with in collective bargaining helps people who are not necessarily union members,
Correct.
But who are in the industry.
Correct.
Okay. There also seems to have been a growing anti-union feeling in the country.
Yes.
Both by political parties, but among just regular people as well.
Well, actually, that's been turning around. I would say we found the low point about union approval is right after the 2008 recession. And that was the low point in the last 50 years or so. But since 2009, public approval of unions has been going up. And now it's back up to a historic high. Close to 60% of the public say that they approve of unions. And actually, a lot of young people in particular say they not only approve of unions, but they would like to have a union in their workplace.
It would seem to be counterintuitive for them not to want a union.
Yes, right. I think for a while there was a sense that unions were outdated. They were something for the, the old economy, that they
corrupt.
were not. Yes, that they were corrupt. Maybe affiliated with, mobsters and so forth. But that has really turned around, and I think campaigns like the Fight for 15 or unions being involved in public teacher struggles has made young people really understand that, having a union is good not just for them as workers, but as citizens.
Certainly conservative politicians and a lot of employees have argued that, unions are bad for business, and if it's bad for business, it's bad for workers.
Right.
But, is there any proof that unions are bad for workers?
Well, no, it's interesting because even some of the conservative employer organizations, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, have come out in recent years saying that actually we are suffering, the economies of the world are suffering because unions have gotten so weak. They have even agreed with the assessment that when you have weak unions and weak collective bargaining, it exacerbates inequality. And inequality is bad for so many measures. It's bad for health outcomes, it's bad for economic growth. So weakening unions is actually bad for everyone, it turns out.
In the public sector, unions have been able to hold on better. Why?
Well, I think that there's more job security in the public sector. It's also that, the public sector hasn't been as aggressive. And what I was mentioning in terms of the union avoidance industry, where we have private corporations hiring, lawyers and consultants to break the union, we hadn't seen that in the public sector. Now that has shifted a bit with these recent court attacks and some aggressive political attacks against unions. So it's becoming a bit harder in the public sector. I think we're at a moment, with these court cases, we're going to either see a rapid decline in the public sector or we're going to see a reshift and public sector unions acting very differently.
Do you see, you're obviously an observer of, union activity, worker activity. Do you see union organizing activity going on?
Yeah, so we're in a very fascinating moment. Even going back to Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin when he went after the public sector unions in that state, examples like the Milwaukee Public Teachers Union, they really reshifted their orientation and they said, a union's not just about raising wages, it is about that, but it's also about, having a voice in the curriculum, having social justice curriculum, having a voice protecting students and the community, defending public schools as a concept. And they've been able to retain their membership despite public sector union membership declining in the state. So we're seeing a lot of innovative and new militant actions by unions right now, from school teachers to flight attendants, to even manufacturing workers. I think we're in a very interesting moment.
Now, New York it's the state with the highest level of union membership,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think that we've had just a history of stronger unions, larger workplaces. The city of New York, just the public sector workforce is massive. And so we have these strong unions that have still managed to have a voice in government. It'll be interesting because I think the unions are being challenged. They're being forced to try new things and confront this new reality with the Janus Supreme Court ruling. Unions are going to have to change the way they do business, and they can't just have a narrow focus on their members anymore. They have to really look at how they're helping build the community as well.
I know that, in New York City, we have a very strong teachers union.
Yes.
And I know that in various mayoral administrations, the teachers union has been a target
Yes.
of the administrations, and they say, that's why we can't bring about reforms in the public schools, because you have all of these onerous union rules that protect the teachers. But and some of them may be bad, but my experience is that if you don't have those rules, you really get screwed. As a teacher,
Right.
as an employee.
Exactly, and I think even as students, I think that you need some kind of organized voice that really gives the other side of the story from the school board. And there's pressures always from the employer to cut costs, and who's going to speak up on the other side? Students don't have a collective voice, and teachers don't have a collective voice. Unions have a lot to do a better job, but we don't have any other alternatives. Workers don't have political parties. Workers don't have, other kinds of organizations that really promote a democratic voice in society for how workers and citizens should have the economy run.
I've read that one difference between the United States and Europe is that in Europe, there are political parties that always been political parties that were affiliated
Yes.
with the unions, labor parties. We don't have that here. Now, supposedly the Democratic Party is the party that supports the union. But in one of the articles I read, it says but it hasn't supported them very well.
No.
Is that true?
I would say that's true. I think that the U.S. is an exception among industrialized countries for never having had a labor party or something like it. The Democrats have at times been in alliance with the unions, but it's never been a formal relationship. Unions have never had an actual formal voice within setting the platform of the party, picking candidates, helping to run the party, and there's no accountability. So it's been a one-way relationship where unions put all of their resources into electing mostly Democrats and get very little in return. And in fact, some of the Democratic Party has been on the forefront of attacking the teachers' unions, promoting charter schools, promoting educational reform that really undercuts teachers' rights.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with Stephanie Luce, Professor of Labor Studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate School. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking to Stephanie Luce, Professor of Labor Studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate School. So, that we know that the union membership has taken a sharp dive certainly since the 50s. So what's been the impact on working people?
Yeah, the impact has been really tragic, I would say. We've seen in some occupations declining wages or stagnant wages. We've seen having more people have to enter the paid labor force, increase in hours of work, more insecure work. Without a union contract, you can be fired at any time, even without cause in some states. And just general insecurity and really a large impact in terms of benefits, in terms of people's ability to access health insurance or pensions. And that has had an impact. It hurts not only the people affected, but their family members, their communities. It's widespread impact.
We hear a lot about growing income inequality in this country. In 2015, Americans in the top 1% average 40 times more income than the bottom 90%. If they were in the top 10%, they average more than 9 times the income as the bottom 90%. And you also read stories about the CEOs of companies who are earning hundreds of times more than the median income of their workers. Is this disparity, do you think, partly due to the decline of unions, or is something else at work?
Absolutely. And it's a problem not just in the United States, but globally. In many countries, they're experiencing this widening inequality, and we have inequality between countries. And so a growing number of economists have said that this is unsustainable. We cannot continue to grow economically with this level of inequality. We don't have a consumer base to buy goods, and also there's a lot of political unrest, a lot of political instability as people are angry and people are not willing to put up with it anymore.
And yet you have this small number of people with a huge amount of income.
Yeah.
Are there other reasons for this growing income equality? People talk about globalization and the outsourcing of what were good-paying jobs to other countries.
Yeah, I mean, globalization is a factor, but I would say it's a small factor, because even when you look at jobs moving, you can have jobs moving from Detroit to South Carolina, right? So they're moving even within the country. It's not even necessarily globalization. What it is that corporations have a lot more power. The rules have changed, the laws have changed. Looking at just the ability of corporations to move jobs and investments anywhere around the world, compare that to workers' rights. Workers can't cross borders. We have tightened immigration laws at the same time we are loosening up for corporations. So I would just say increased corporate power is really part of the reason that we see this tremendous inequality.
Okay. Technology is a factor.
Technology, yes. It is a factor, but then again, it's always been a factor, and we can go back hundreds of years and see constantly, employers always want to introduce new technologies to save money. That's kind of a constant in our economy. And I think the question is really, who controls the technology and to what purpose? If it's used to save lives, if it's used to cut out dangerous jobs, it can be a good thing. But if workers lose their jobs and just are thrown into the streets, then that's a problem.
In every presidential election cycle, candidates talk about creating jobs.
Right.
I'm going to come in, I'm going to create jobs, I'm going to create better paying jobs. It's always a campaign promise. Right. Have any elected officials that you know of done anything substantial to create more and better jobs?
I would say not so much recently. There's an economist named Ha-Joon Chang who writes about, how did rich countries become rich? How did they create these jobs? And generally it takes a pretty massive government role, whether that's in research and development, creating infrastructure, creating public education, strategic thinking about the industries. Sometimes it's through war and bad things too. But, we can't really politicians can't create jobs one by luring one company here at a time. It really has to be a larger systemic approach to creating the foundation and the infrastructure needed for economic growth.
So what kind of policies, what kind of legislation would we be talking about that would do that, other than just, luring other employers?
Well, I do think things like the Green New Deal that people talk about would create lots of jobs, both in the infrastructure, creating new technologies for green technologies, but also expanding the needs that we have. We have lots of needs in the society in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of environmental retrofitting. And there's a big role for governments to play to be visionary on that, to really make the investments in the long term in that kind of growth.
So if unions are no longer fighting for 90% of the working people in this country, right, who, if anyone, is fighting for them?
Well, that's what is interesting about this moment. I think a lot of unions, even though they have a small number of members, they are increasingly fighting for people beyond their membership. Things like fighting for higher minimum wages doesn't generally affect union members. That's not usually union members who are getting the minimum wage increase. Things like universal health care, immigration reform, a social justice curriculum in the schools. So I think there are unions fighting for the working class more broadly.
That are pushing for that politically.
Yes,
okay.
Right. But you're right, there aren't a lot of other voices. It's not necessarily coming from our elected politicians.
You do hear, I know, in like the past 10, 20 years about activists on behalf of, say, domestic workers, fast food workers in New York State. So these are not necessarily union driven, but somebody's out there, and it seems to have, what do you know about that, and has it had any impact on the wages and conditions under which workers work?
Yeah. So some of those organizations are what we call worker centers, and they're not formal unions under labor law, but they bring together workers in regions to fight for better conditions and in other ways. And a lot of what we've seen is a growth in what people call labor community coalitions. There's organizations like one called Jobs with Justice, other organizations that aren't unions but are worker-based. A lot of them they are working with unions. So for example, the Fight for 15 movement with fast food, that brings together unions and community organizations, housing right organizations and students together to raise wages. They've had tremendous success, and I would say to my own surprise, I study low-wage work, and I've been shocked at the victories that tens of millions of workers have received significant raises as a result of these movements.
I assume you're not expecting unions to make a big comeback in the United States.
I'm not sure. I actually think this is the moment in 10 to 20 years, we're going to look back and say this was the moment either that the labor movement died out altogether or made a
or that came back.
Yeah, because there's a lot of indications. We're seeing the teacher strikes, for example, in unexpected states, unexpected places. And again, like the flight attendants being on the forefront of challenging the government shutdown. I think we're seeing a lot of stirrings that are going to be interesting.
What do you want to see happen?
Well, I think, this system is not sustainable for anyone. It's not working for the environment. It's not working for most working class people. It's not working for the 99%. I think we need unions to be revitalized, but I think, in the direction that they are speaking on behalf of the broader community. They must fight for their workforce. They must fight in the workplace for more fair rules, but they have to be addressing the larger systemic questions, such as, what's the future of our economy?
Tell me about the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. It used to have a different name.
Yes, it used to be the Murphy Institute, the Joseph S. Murphy Institute. And this past fall, we launched as the new school in the CUNY system, I believe the 25th school. And it's pretty exciting because this is actually something that unions helped push forward, workers helped push forward. And people said, this is the People's University. New York City and New York State fund this, and we should have a school for labor and urban issues. So we have bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and certificate programs, and do lots of public programming.
Do you, so I'm interested in what students are taught there. Do you train them? What are they learning?
What do they learn?
What does one learn in a labor school? Is it about labor history? I guess what I'm getting at is, do you teach them for activism? Is that part of your program?
Many of the students come from an activist background or are union members or union activists or leaders, and some are just the general public, working adults. What kind of ties them together is a mission of social justice, the idea that we are a public university and we should be learning to make the world a better place. And so I would say that our students are bringing in their own knowledge, but also learning both the theory and practice to fight for a better world.
Okay. So you have bachelor's degree programs, you have master's degree. Is there also PhD? Is that part of it?
Not yet, maybe someday. But for example, our master's degree in labor studies, students learn labor law, labor history, labor economics, organizing. They learn about globalization and immigration. And so they're really taking a wide view. We're trying to look at this as, in the past, some labor study programs were really very specific about, arbitration and collective bargaining. And those are important and people still learn those, but we're also teaching in a broader perspective about what would it look like if workers had a greater control in the economy, if we actually had, input in the policies that are not just about the contract, the union contract, but about what kinds of jobs we need in this world.
Are your students older? Are they actually working people as opposed to young students?
Yeah, many of the students are. I would say maybe 60% are older working adults, but we have also young students who are also right out of college in the master's program. And we also, some of our bachelor's students are also traditional age. That's what makes the place so exciting is, in the classroom you'll have everyone from, a 20-year-old up to a 70-year-old. We have retired people who are coming because they're very invested in the future of the world and they want to be reading and learning and engaged.
And I would imagine that some of them would be working people who are looking to advance in their jobs, and so they feel that a credential, an extra credential, would help.
Yes, some of our students work for the city, or they are school teachers. Some of them are actually professors at CUNY, and so for some it allows them a raise or promotion. And others are looking to be better activists, and others just want intellectual engagement, and they find that they don't have other spaces in their lives just to read and think and learn, and so they come and join the classroom.
Okay, well, as a longtime union member and someone who's been on the picket lines,
yes, okay.
the time of the picket lines, it's really going to be interesting to me to see what happens to unions in this country.
Yes, I think it's a great moment.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank Stephanie Luce, Professor of Labor Studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate School, for joining me. For One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.